Beneath the surface of America's forgotten countryside, there are stories so disturbing they were never meant to leave the walls of rotting farmhouses. Imagine a man whose very existence was the product of blood folding in on itself, generation after generation. His face carried the proof, a jaw that never fully formed, eyes that wandered in opposite directions, and a body trapped somewhere between adulthood and decay. But his greatest secret was not carved into his bones. It was the fact that for nearly his entire life, he shared his bed with the one woman he should never have touched. His sister. Together they lived, together they slept, and together they buried their shame in the silence of a dying town that pretended not to see. Tonight, we open that door. Tonight, we uncover the most inbred man who slept with his sister for life. He was born in the backwoods, where names faded and family trees grew twisted. His parents were cousins, their parents' cousins before them. By the time he arrived, the bloodline had already collapsed in on itself like a house with rotted beams. His cries echoed through a cabin where every face carried a familiar resemblance, where no child looked truly different from the last. The community whispered about them, but no one dared to intervene. This was not a family. They were a closed circle, a world within a world, where outsiders were feared and kin were everything. The boy grew up never knowing the boundary between brother and friend, sister and something more. His sister, older by a few years, became the center of his universe. She was not beautiful by any means, but to him, she was the only woman who smiled at him, who touched his hand, who spoke his name with something resembling care. The isolation of their bloodline had created not just deformities of the body, but deformities of the heart. Desire had no proper outlet. Love had nowhere else to go, and so it turned inward, festering until brother and sister were no longer simply kin, but partners in a union no one dared name aloud. When the town caught hints of their secret, it was too late. They had already sealed their lives together. For decades they lived like shadows, two figures moving as one, tending to the land, locked in a routine that no preacher could break and no law dared to confront. What they shared was not love in the way the world understands it. It was survival, it was habit, it was a curse written into their very blood. And the saddest part, neither of them knew anything different. To them, this was life, this was normal, this was home. The neighbors spoke of them in hushed tones, never daring to say their names too loudly. Children were warned not to wander near their property, not because of violence, but because of something far worse, contamination. The farm was a place where time stood still, where the same faces seemed to reappear with every generation. And yet, behind closed doors, the bond between the brother and sister grew stronger, darker, and more undeniable. He was not capable of seeing her as forbidden because no one had ever taught him what forbidden meant. To him, she was comfort in a life otherwise defined by silence and hunger. To her, he was all that was left. As the years passed, their bodies withered under the strain of their bloodline. His spine bent unnaturally, giving him a crooked gait, while his jaw jutted forward as if resisting the very act of speech. Her eyes sagged, her skin stretched thin across high cheekbones that revealed more bone than flesh. And yet, when they looked at one another, they saw something tender. It was the tenderness of isolation. Two people trapped on an island, holding onto each other not out of passion, but because they feared drowning alone. The villagers knew more than they admitted. They knew the family tree had wrapped itself so tightly it no longer bore fruit, only shadows. They knew this brother and sister would never escape, because there was nothing left to escape to. Still, the whispers grew louder. Farmers passing by at night swore they saw only one bed in the house when the lantern light flickered through the window. A visiting preacher left in disgust after catching a glance of how they leaned on each other's bodies, not with the innocence of kin, but with the intimacy of husband and wife. And then there were the children who never survived. A handful of graves dotted the edge of their land, unmarked, too small to notice unless you knew where to look. Each time the sister's face grew more sunken, her eyes more haunted. Each time the brother buried another secret beneath the soil. They could not stop, even when they knew what would come of it. It was not desire that kept them together. It was the trap of blood, the cage of family that had become their prison. The saddest part of their story was not that they sinned, but that they never believed they had a choice. When the outsiders finally dared to confront them, it was not with anger, but with pity. A county official, sent after rumors of neglect and decay, stepped onto the property one autumn afternoon. He described the house as a tomb, wood rotting, curtains stained yellow with decades of dust, the air so thick with mildew it clung to his lungs. And there they were, sitting side by side in the dim light, brother and sister, their hands entwined as though separation would mean death. The official later wrote that they looked more like two relics than living people, bound not only by blood, but by the weight of their own history. He tried to speak with them, but conversation was nearly impossible. Words stumbled out of the brother's crooked mouth, half-formed and hard to understand. The sister spoke clearer, though her tone was strangely childlike, as if she had never grown beyond the innocence of a girl. And perhaps she hadn't. The house had trapped them both in a permanent childhood, a world where they never learned what it meant to leave, to grow, to choose something beyond the boundaries of family. What unsettled the visitors most was not the deformity of their bodies, but the calmness with which they accepted their fate. There was no shame in their eyes, no attempt to deny what they were. They had lived so long inside the silence that truth and secrecy no longer mattered. To them, there was no line between right and wrong. There was only survival. And survival meant clinging to the one person who had always been there, no matter the cost. The county could have forced them apart. They could have institutionalized him, taken her away, placed them into the care of strangers. But in that moment, no one wanted to intervene. It was too late. To break them apart would be like tearing the roots out of a tree that had grown twisted but unmovable. They were left to live out their years in isolation, the community watching from a distance, sometimes with disgust, sometimes with a strange, morbid sympathy. It became easier to pretend they didn't exist, easier to let the house crumble quietly into the earth rather than confront the horror within its walls. The story might have ended there, in silence, if not for what came next. Winter has a way of exposing what people try to hide. Snow clung to their roof, seeping through broken shingles, freezing the air inside until the siblings huddled together under a single blanket. It was during one of these winters that tragedy finally clawed its way to the surface. Neighbors spoke of screams in the night, muffled cries that carried across the barren fields. By morning, the house was silent again, its windows frosted white, its door hanging ajar as if the wind itself had forced its way inside. When someone dared to step across the threshold, they found the sister collapsed near the hearth. Her body was frail, her breath shallow, her skin the pale grey of someone fading from this world. Beside her sat her brother, rocking back and forth, clutching her hand as though willing her back to life. His cries were incoherent, half animal, half human, a sound that chilled even the most hardened men. For decades, she had been his anchor, the only constant in a life twisted by blood and secrecy. And now, that anchor was breaking. The villagers tried to intervene, but the brother would not release her hand. He growled, screamed, and struck out at anyone who came too close, as though they were thieves attempting to steal the only thing he had ever truly loved. When she finally exhaled her last breath, he refused to believe it. He laid her on the bed they had shared, smoothed her hair back, and whispered her name over and over until it became meaningless sound. For days he stayed in that room, unwilling to leave her side. The authorities arrived eventually, dragging her body away for burial. He followed them barefoot through the snow, his frame bent and shaking, muttering curses at the men who lowered her into the ground. That night, he returned to the grave, clawing at the frozen earth until his hands bled. They had to restrain him, bind him, and finally lead him back to the hollow house that had become nothing more than a mausoleum. Without her, he was no longer a man, just a husk, drifting through the empty halls, speaking to shadows, waiting for death to deliver him back to her. And when death came, it was as quiet as the life he had endured. No family gathered, no preacher prayed, just the sound of dirt falling on wood, another grave added to the unmarked soil where their children already slept. But his story did not end with that burial. If anything, that was only when the truth began to spread, whispered like a curse across generations. Long after the house caved in and the last of the family's name disappeared from county records, their story lingered. Farmers told it to their sons while working in the fields, not as gossip, but as a warning. Stray travelers swore they could still see a figure at dusk, limping through the skeletal remains of the barn, his head bent, searching for something forever lost. And though most dismissed it as folklore, there were those who had looked too closely into the graves at the edge of the property and knew the whispers were rooted in truth. The brother and sister became less like people and more like phantoms of the land itself. Their story was not just about incest or deformity, it was about what happens when isolation becomes destiny. Their lives proved that blood, when folded in upon itself long enough, does not simply twist the body. It twists the mind, the soul, and even the boundaries of what we call love. What they shared was not affection as the world knows it, but something darker, dependency so complete it eroded all sense of right and wrong. For the community, the memory of them became both shame and fascination. Some insisted they were victims of a cursed bloodline, trapped in a cycle they never chose. Others saw them as monsters, unworthy of sympathy, proof that sin rots not only the flesh, but the generations that follow. But the truth was far more unsettling. They were neither saints nor demons. They were simply human beings raised in an environment where the world outside their family might as well have been another planet. What choices could they have made when choice itself had been erased before they were born? Their story was passed down in fragments, reshaped with each telling, until fact and myth blurred together. But one detail never changed. They had lived together, shared a bed, and clung to one another until death. That detail could not be softened, could not be explained away. It haunted the county like a shadow that refused to lift. Even now, when the wind cuts across the abandoned fields, some claim it carries a sound, two voices murmuring from within a house that no longer stands, a brother and sister bound by a secret too disturbing to forget. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Generations later, when genealogists dug into the county archives, they stumbled upon the faint traces of the brother and sister's existence. Old marriage records, census lists, and birth certificates revealed names that repeated over and over, identical surnames joining together on every line. It was a family tree without branches, a spiral that looped back onto itself until it collapsed into a single point. The siblings were not an accident. They were the inevitable outcome of a bloodline that had never been allowed to breathe. What startled the researchers most were the gaps, years missing from the records. Children who appeared on one census only to vanish by the next, their graves left unmarked, their deaths unspoken. It was as if the family had been trying to erase itself, to bury the shame deeper than the soil could hold, and yet, no matter how many pages were missing, the truth could not be erased. The inbreeding had become their legacy, their defining feature, passed down as faithfully as a surname. In forgotten boxes at the county courthouse, brittle photographs surfaced, faces blurred by time, yet unmistakable in their resemblance, crooked smiles, sunken eyes, and foreheads too broad to ignore. Each photograph looked less like a new generation and more like a faded copy of the one before it. The line had not grown, it had only repeated, and at the center of the final photograph was the man himself, standing beside his sister, their bodies leaning toward one another as though gravity itself was pulling them closer. It was not a family portrait, it was a confession captured on film. Historians debated whether to make the findings public, fearing the scandal it might bring to those who still carried fragments of the family name, but silence has a way of preserving rot. By refusing to speak of them, the story only grew more monstrous in the imagination. And P. Raps that was fitting because their lives were not a simple tale of forbidden love or human weakness. They were a warning carved into the bones of America's forgotten places, a reminder of what happens when a family closes itself off, when blood becomes the only bond left to cling to. Even now, their house is gone, their names nearly erased, but the story lingers like a sickness in the air. Some say that curses die with the body, others know the truth. Curses travel through memory, kept alive by those who dare to whisper them aloud. The final chapter of their story is not written in ink nor in stone, but in the unease that lingers wherever their tale is told. People like to imagine that such horrors are buried in the past, that we have moved beyond them, that inbreeding and isolation are relics of forgotten times. But the truth is darker. Across the back roads of America, there are still families who close their doors to the outside, who cling to their own blood as though it were salvation. Their houses sag beneath the weight of generations, their names rarely leaving county lines, and when you look closely, too closely, you begin to see echoes of the same fate, faces that resemble one another too perfectly, whispers of children who never survived, the same silence that surrounded the brother and sister long ago. The man who slept with his sister for life was not an isolated monster. He was a symptom of something deeper, something rooted in poverty, isolation, and shame. He was born into a world where escape was impossible, where ignorance replaced choice, and where survival meant clutching the only hand within reach. His life was tragic, not because he broke a taboo, but because he never even knew it was broken. His sister was his world, his family, his partner, his prison. Together, they built a life not out of love, but out of necessity, and in doing so, they created a story so haunting that even death could not silence it. When we speak of them now, it is not for the thrill of the grotesque, but for the weight of the warning. Isolation breeds shadows, silence grows rot. Families that lock themselves away do not preserve themselves. They decay from within until their names become curses whispered by strangers. That brother and sister may have died, their graves unmarked, their house crumbled to dust, but their story remains because it was never theirs alone. It belongs to every hidden corner, every forgotten family that tries to bury its shame in secrecy. So when you walk through the countryside and see a house sagging on its foundations, when you hear stories too disturbing to repeat, remember him, remember her, remember the most inbred man who slept with his sister for life, and know that some histories are not dead, they are waiting, just beneath the soil, for someone brave enough to dig them back up.